It's my distinct honor to introduce Marilynne Robinson, who really doesn't need an introduction, but I'll give you the bare bones basics. She is the author of a number of celebrated novels, including Gilead, winner of the 2005 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction and the National Book Critics Circle Award. Home, which won the Orange Prize and the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, and Lila, winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award. Her first novel, Housekeeping, won the Hemingway Foundation PEN Award. In 2021, all 4 Gilead novels were selected for Oprah's Book Club. Her nonfiction books include What Are We Doing Here?, The Givenness of Things, When I Was a Child I Read Books, Absence of Mind, The Death of Adam, and Mother Country. For her long and distinguished career in both fiction and nonfiction, Robinson received a 2012 National Humanities Medal. Her forthcoming book, Reading Genesis, will be published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux. Please join me in welcoming Marilynne Robinson.
Thank you. The title of my paper is The Problem with My Solution. And I hope that after I have read it, you will know what the problem was and what the solution was also. No, what the solution was, and then what was the problem that followed after my feeling I had a solution. I assume I'm audible, right? Yes? Okay. I would say before I begin, I'm very, very, very receptive to questions. I love them. So I assume you will have questions when I have finished reading. All I will say about the paper that I'm about to read is that it proceeds on the assumption that there has been progress in science, as we use the word in a very general sense, that oversteps the issues of conflict and controversy that have been the subject, frankly, of this discussion. I'm talking about quantum physics, which I think properly should sort of at least radically alter the terms in which we think about both science and what is possible as religious exploration of the questions of being. Okay? So here I go. My precocious older brother wanted me to be precocious too. Just a minute. So I was introduced in adolescence to important ideas, among them philosophical determinism, which sank into my heart like lead. I could imagine no escape from it for the purposes of my own understanding of the world, of my own life, and not least by any means my conception of God. If there is a causal chain that determines every choice, every action, every event, then we are simply obliged to act out dramas of hope and passion, and for that matter, good and evil, feeling our fears and urgencies almost as intensely as we do in dreams, and to no more real effect, since the necessity that will act through us, that will make us tremble, weep, sweat, is always on its way to its next effect in every human actor on the planet, as in every buzzard, worm, and virus. It was and is a kind of a conceptual totalism, a monism without the aesthetics of oneness. All being is part of a great mechanism grinding away toward its own collective enhancement in the most optimistic view. Enhancement relative to what? From the point of view of survival and reproduction, a cockroach is more to be admired than a peacock, a virus than either. Now that we have changed the environment in ways we have little grasp of, and now that we must assume the planet will continue to change as the effects of our presence accumulate and compound, advantage in Darwinist terms will have to be renegotiated continuously, obscuring all question of fitness. Though we have troubled the natural order profoundly, determinism will still govern within accidental and unstable environments that defeat optimization. Evolution is necessarily contingent upon climate and environment, as we have known since we became aware of the dinosaurs. Still, within the microclimates and microenvironments that will result, some instantaneously, from oil spills and coal dust and reactor shine, whatever metamorphosis may occur will still be determined by circumstance, as surely as circumstance governed when we could think of tooth and claw as primary drivers of change. Our imprint on the world is a kind of moral fable. We humans are entrapped in the consequences of the choices we have made. Any rescue we could find would have to be called grace, and grace cannot be a factor in a determinist universe. The grand casuistical regime of cause and effect forbids even the slightest departure from its laws. Whatever fails to conform to them is utterly disallowed. This has been the model of rational thought, at least since Newton, himself, of course, a mystic. I have found grace in the fact that the deepest researches made into being itself do not support a determinist model. I realize that this is an intrusion of my own habits of mind on a chaste and beautiful field of thought that might best be allowed to flourish on its own fantastical terms without the imposition of old philosophical or theological categories, old frustrations with what had always seemed to be the nature of things. That said, on closer scrutiny, all kinds of certainties do vanish, leaving hardly a rack behind. Time and space, for example. Quantum physics has been emerging since the turn of the 20th century, withstanding skepticism, experiment, and use so thoroughly that it has become a settled feature of contemporary science and technology, so that early amazement at what it says and implies may have dimmed its sheer utility, making it seem commonplace. At the scale of utility, it works like a charm. At the scale of its implications, it all but sweeps away the little world in which it seems to have become naturalized and domesticated. I've written elsewhere about the harmony between the instantaneousness of a reality brought into being continuously through the decoherence of a spectrum of possibility, and let there be and there was. I'm saying if my language is obscure on one hand or inexact on the other, I'm sorry if my language is opaque on one hand or inexact on the other. My particularity emerged from the primal deep, the tohu vavohu, or chaos, out of which creation was realized. Mighty John Milton, whose foreknowledge was not absolute, but impressive all the same, describes the potent and potential chaos of uncreation through which his Satan flies. Now we know these things about the void could be true, says Milton. It is a dark, illimitable ocean without bound, without dimension, where length, breadth, and height, and time and place are lost. Then earth, for Milton, that pendant jewel, and Eden, and humankind. The beauty of quantum is that it allows for a creation relative to which God is free, but one which is stable in that it reflects God's steadfast intention. Jonathan Edwards called creation arbitrary, the manifestation of no other necessity, no other influence than a faithful and wholly efficacious will. This accords well with the covenant relationship with the world that characterizes the God of Scripture. Quantum ultimately describes everything so far as we now know. The very strangeness of it somehow suggests to me that a stranger physics lies behind it. But for the moment, it is the vocabulary quantum provides that lets us consider the meaning of the fact that everything is made of atoms. This venerable truth means we know now that indeterminacy pervades existence. My version of the creation might lead one to think that the world of our experience is in some sense here while quantum is somehow there, as if indeterminacy were excluded as quantum resolved itself into tables and chairs. But no, the reality quantum describes is utterly pervasive. In fact, it can hardly be said to describe anything, since its most remarkable effect is to make the qualities we assign to our known world vanish. I have mentioned time and space. Apophatic science. I find I cannot think the word universe without conjuring space-time, so I have tried substituting the Latin word res, R-E-S, taking it to mean the thing to be considered, to accommodate some of the variables and uncertainties that are its sum and substance, as it were. I know that in using the word I risk being mistaken. It sounds like too many things. I may seem here to speak of two separate things, reality as we experience it on one hand, and protean scintillate quantum on the other, when they are simultaneous, identical, the self-same phenomenon. If phenomenon is a word I should use in this context, as I strongly suspect it is not. The poet Wallace Stevens speaks of the, T-H-E. By my lights, the most astonishing thing is not quantum entanglement, not the so-called observer effect, but the existence for our purposes of solid reality, available to our senses and our use, certain despite uncertainty, actual, not probabilistic. It is as if we have been given a dwelling place, an island in an endless sea, in Eden, given the accessibility to influence that is characteristic of being at quantum scales, so that attention, even simple presence, can have an effect. This accommodating of our world to our humanity, this suiting of ourselves to the world, could be thus by divine fiat, by means of that word that was in the beginning with God, without whom nothing was made. It has been a long time since science and religion have seemed so readily reconciled to one another. This seems beautiful to me. I am always happy to find a good metaphor. It also fills me with trepidation. It solves my old problem. We live within a world of local reality, if I can be forgiven language that suggests an enclave of some sort. The world of our experience offers no real alternative to a conception of order that looks like necessity, that looks deterministic. We know now that it is pervaded by a more absolute reality that is not governed by the rules of proximate effect. Put them side by side, so to speak, and the experienced world, with its incapacities and rigidities, has the look of an artifact. Quantum entanglement means that change in half a photon results in a simultaneous change of the same kind in its other half at any theoretical distance. This is a phenomenon that, generalized, explored, applied, has assumed great significance. It would seem to bear no relation to cause and effect as we have quite reasonably understood them. Set one against another, and Newtonian physics looks constrained, arbitrary, using that word to mean imposed by will. I don't think Newton would object to that either. What is possible in absolute terms is impossible within the same system of being, in the world of our experience. Einstein said that the most remarkable thing about the universe is that we can understand it. We do have an impressive degree of understanding of the universe, much of it owed to Einstein, who, by the way, was skeptical of quantum physics, though his contributions were essential to its development. We have his universe of billowing space-time, abysmal gulfs and planets in full sail, beautiful and descriptive. Then we have what I have called the race, the RES, Latin, however awkwardly, the deeper, still all-inclusive order that manifests freedom we can't explain and contingencies we can't account for. By the res, the thing to be considered, I mean whatever there is, at whatever we move from being as we know it. Imagine it, have any analogies for it, or participation in it. To say that determinism is banished because it is embraced, so to speak, by a grand regime of uncertainty and seeming randomness implies that the second somehow conditions or qualifies the first, yet without disrupting it. Theologically considered, this seems to me to speak to the great mystery, to offer a possible model for God's interaction with the world. More trepidation. I think Calvin is right that the human mind is great at creating idols, excessively confident conceptions of God. I will say in my defense that determinism in every form has excluded the idea of God from any meaningful presence with regard to the world. Granting a quantum reality, nothing could be changed in whole or in part, I'm reading that. Granting a quantum reality, being could be changed in whole or in part by a word, a thought, a glance. However attributed, creation did not end with Genesis. I find all this deeply and pleasingly suggestive. Nevertheless, Calvin's warning must be respected. I am confronting my idea of God, I am conforming my idea of God to my needs and my preferences. These are so abstract as to seem impersonal, perhaps, though I have worried over them for decades. I know that there might indeed be a more radical physics yet to come, and another after that. I must be careful to keep all this within the limits of metaphor. In fact, I know now where it fails gravely, even as metaphor. Science, as impersonal as it seems to be and tries to be, is a human project, influenced by culture and history. Quantum theory posits many worlds or multiple universes which proliferate because whenever a choice is made, new universes exist in which all other possible choices are made. Presumably, since the possible is generally arrayed along a sort of spectrum, when one choice is made, all unmade choices have their own universes. You, as the actor, are therefore the actor in all the other variants the choice presents. The self becomes also the opposite of itself and departs from itself in every degree the spectrum of possibility requires. Predictably, considering culture and history, this shivering of the self into an array of choices that cancel one another out amounts to an erasure of self, an odd effect of its having caused universes to come into being. If you decide not to shoot your uncle, in a brand new universe you pull the trigger, compelled to do this because you, in the originating universe, chose not to. So we arrive back at a very baroque and perhaps inevitable determinism. If it is at second hand, still the self is implicated. Finding homicide ethically repulsive, I have compelled it in myself once removed. I have liberated humankind from determinism only to throw the possibility of meaningful choice deeply into doubt. I have tried to set aside worldly conceptions of space and time and the word universe with them. Have I discredited the notion of universes popping into being even as I write these words? For my purposes, which are of no interest to science, I hope so. Putting aside all other considerations, here the self is surrendered with startling readiness. This marks the theory, in this elaboration of it at least, as being modern in an invidious sense of the word. A teacher told me once that art reduces chaos to meaningful complexity. If the universe of our experience, so anomalous within the context and matrix of the physics of the subatomic is as it is because possibility is constrained, and if the act of creation might be thought of as intention imposing purposeful constraint, then an intentional creation, one that values the human self, might arbitrarily exclude all this. Physicists speak of beauty and elegance as affirming the truth value of a formula or a hypothesis, and many reject the idea of multiple universes as inelegant. It seems preposterous to me, but I am a mere onlooker. Of interest to me is the fact that the self can be dismembered, so to speak, deprived of agency, even identity, in the very fact of being the occasion of new worlds. This erasure of the self is oddly human-centered, even though presumably a manatee that chose to eat a water lily or to abstain from it would also occasion another universe. The human instance seems to me to be the most complex that could be proposed, since our nature gives us many kinds of autonomy, which is to say many choices, a fair portion of which we experience as ethical or moral. We seem to be more or less unique in this. Is it only tradition that bases morality in the individual and in the consensus of individuals? Can morality be thought of as existing on any other terms? Need it exist? Here is the problem with my solution. This beautiful physics has no place in it for the human. Neither did any scientific cosmology that preceded it after Newton. We are so used to this exclusion that it can seem like sentimentality or special pleading to note the omission. The exclusion of the human has been enforced as if it were objectivity, and so has the exclusion of anything that might imply that some trace of the intellectual habits of theism might linger. Is it reasonable to suppose that a modest reverence for the human self, not out of enlightened decorum, but as acknowledgement of the singular thing it is, might affect the shape and emphasis of thought about the cosmos? Is there any more telling evidence of what all these photons and quarks can blossom into than a human brain? Their chimerical brilliance is on display in any infant acquiring language or learning to read facial expressions. Ergo, as we used to say, should not human intelligence define the question of the nature of the physical universe, beginning with its subatomic basis where the business of the mind is transacted? True, we have only begun to acquaint ourselves with the subatomic over the last 120 years, and in that same period, positivism, Darwinism, Marxism, and behaviorism flourished, offering generic and reductionist models of human beings, all in effect primitives, in a time before that word and concept had come under scrutiny. There is no reason to rescue the stodgy beast out of the determinist world, only to have selfhood denied to it again as an inevitable consequence of a theory that should be questioned on the grounds that it cannot accommodate anything that bears the slightest resemblance to the complex human self. All this is only stranger in light of the fact that science is, itself, quintessentially human. Science is a Latin word that means knowing, a participle. It values acquired information and understanding vastly less than it does those acts of the mind that transform and transcend what has been known. What must it have felt like to be Newton or Einstein in the times of their great realizations? We all know a little, having had realizations of our own. But the heroes of science lived out an extraordinary selfhood. This is as true of them as it is of any painter or poet or perhaps any saint. And it was a great moment in the history of quantum theory when experimenters realize that their mere presence influences the outcome of an experiment. Science has provided many proofs of human brilliance and efficacy, so how can the human self be reduced to a cipher, even disallowed by science? Calvin says we know God by descending into ourselves, and we know ourselves in our knowledge of God. Metaphorically speaking, we are entangled. Neither time nor distance intervenes between us. Quantum theory offers 1,000 opportunities for metaphors of this kind, simultaneity of absence and presence, of opposite states of being. I can imagine physicists cringing at my abuse of their careful articulations of these things, and theologians warning me that theology should never be dependent on inevitably time-bound science. Theology should never be dependent on inevitably time-bound science, is what I just said. Nevertheless, for generations, theology has struggled in the chains of local realism, or presumptively rational and also commonsensical worldview, which has had the authority of science because it works beautifully at the scale of our experience and because its advance had dispelled errors and produced great, if mingled, benefits. I believe that the famous conflict between science and religion grew out of the incompatible, in fact, irreconcilable languages employed by the two sides. One language is essentially determinist, seeing reality as locked into an undeviating regime of cause and effect, in which neither we nor God himself, granting his existence, could truly intervene. The other has been an articulation of contrary feeling and belief, a language of objection, a defensive language. If religion could recognize the degree to which it has been captive to the assumptions of a brilliant but radically limited science, even in contending with it, if religion could just allow itself to enjoy for a moment the theosophic valorizing implications of the observer phenomenon, then humankind might once again have a place in the cosmos. What is man that thou art mindful of him? And that's it.
Thank you so much. I might begin by asking a question. This is in part a request for a clarification about the quantum physics side of your story. About as I understood it, you're suggesting that the multiple worlds hypothesis excludes the human insofar as the generation of multiple worlds denies human agency, right? That making a choice in this world, right? Exactly. So I'm curious what you think of one solution to that, which is by another fiction author, the science fiction writer Ted Chiang, who has a short story called "Anxiety is the Dizziness of Freedom," and it's about the multiple world hypothesis. And he essentially makes the point that in one part of the story, the world goes to havoc because precisely for this reason, once people realize that there is a version of themselves that does pull the trigger, they start doubting the fact that they have any agency at all, and they wonder why they shouldn't pull the trigger in this world. But what Chang shows is that in the story is that essentially the possibility that they will pull the trigger is not a 50-50 possibility. It actually depends on their development of virtues. So the having developed the correct restraint and virtues like courage, generosity, all the virtues, essentially determines to some extent or tilts the possibility away from the 50-50. So it ends up making making space for human freedom, in a kind of really interesting way. But I also had a question for you, which is, insofar as you're asking, you're kind of pushing for a consideration of human intelligence as at least a starting point, or a part of a part of our thinking about the nature of reality. What do you think of, say, a panpsychist solution? Because panpsychism, is inspired by something like that thinking, right? That intelligence is not just a human phenomenon. Intelligence is everywhere. You can find it at the very, at the subatomic level, and you can find it at the level of, every kind of being.
I'm interested in the human. I mean, I know it's my sort of Christian predisposition. I take it to, I mean, not only Christian, of course, many faiths have the same general view of things, that whether we like it or not, this is about us. And I think the sad and dramatic truth is that we know that we will be the people who extinguish life if it is extinguished. There, you know what I mean? We can see where we're tending. Our importance is very uncomfortable to us, but that does not make us less important, And so if you were to look at the history of Earth as a narrative, you would say, here is its vulnerability, here is its perhaps doom, and it would be us, So I think that the sort of apparent modesty of suppressing the importance of the human being when you think about the world is actually an evasion of a recognition of what in fact we are. Our brilliance, look at what the ultimate consequences of our brilliance may be. We all know, So, I mean, I don't think it's any kind of anthropocentrism on my part that inclines me to believe that we are the mystery. This is where we look, I'm not looking for a way out of that, As far as the other fellow, bless his heart, I mean, if you can change the rules if you write fiction, I know that. I have not come across his view of things in anything written by a scientist,
Yes, Bill.
Thank you very much for a wonderful lecture, and a number of us have to try with some religious or theological humanism for quite some time. So thank you for that. Are you proposing, within that general stance, something like a new metaphysics of morals? That is, that we take human agency, not just thought, human agency as a key to the way we would want to construe the world. That would have to interact with other sciences, but our specific standpoint would be from human beings as moral creatures. Would that be correct?
Yes. Well, I'm not the first to bring up the name Calvin. It makes me very happy. But in any case, Calvin says basically that virtue isn't something you do for your own sake. Virtue is the courtesy you owe other people. And I think that is, how to exist in the world. We are virtuous as a courtesy to other people. If that generalized, think how many problems would go away, I think that our problems in the world are not wholly moral, but they are greatly moral. I think people have created things like, antibiotics and so on that could lead us into disaster, although they have been made scrupulously by people who had only philanthropic motives, in other words, we're strange creatures, and there are things that we do that turn out very badly, even though they're well-intended. But on the other hand, a great deal of what we do is maliciously intended, and I think more overwhelmingly destructive. And our moral obligations are serious because our impact on everything is serious.
Yes.
I was thinking of some of the larger themes of the day about rehabilitation or deeper introspection about, I guess, the overlapping pursuits of science and religion. And I think your talk takes us into that terrain. But it also occurred to me that that there was a point of connection, I think, between your talk and Peter Harrison's talk that might help us, I guess, understand these overlapping pursuits, but also maybe how we ended up with the conflict thesis. But I was really struck by your the sketching out of science as a human pursuit, and that there's a kind of, it's almost like a performative act, that we are being our human selves by using our reason, and what a wonderful thing it is to be able to understand in a way that a Newton can. And it reminded me of these late 19th century histories of science, which would, always start in sort of humans in this primeval time, and as human nature is developing, they have this desire to know more, and that it really comes from this fundamental part of us. But in Peter Harrison's talk, he talked about science performing a legitimating function, and I could see what you outline as going along with, a society that really values using your reason. And I wonder, it seems that science is providing, really does legitimate that and goes along with that. And I wondered if you agreed, and it seems that if it's doing that, then it's hard to dislodge the conflict thesis. But at the same time, I was struck by your comment that I'm interested in the human, and that came from a Christian perspective, because I think, a lot of other people tried to, I'm just thinking of the revival of the classical tradition, Greek, that, this emphasis on reason came from the Greek tradition. But yeah, and I'm feeling like Adrian did earlier, I don't know all of the theological ways in which, in the Christian tradition, you can be interested in the human and have it kind of see us as at the center, and how that would fit into that. But that, that's interesting, right? If there's a long tradition of valorizing our reason in the Christian tradition, and then you have another enterprise that's coming along, it would make sense that the new enterprise would push up the other. Anyway, just a few comments. Thank you.
Well, I think that it's the obligation of science and people who are aware of it, which more people ought to be. It's kind of a failure of science, I think, that there's not more effective real distribution of scientific types of thought into the population. I don't consider Richard Dawkins to be a contributor. But in any case, I think one of the things that is absolutely necessary to do is think about reason. Because the fact is that reason has done a lot of pretty abominable things over the history of human life, many of the crimes and atrocities of the 19th century are directly owed to their conception of what is reason, what's reasonable. With the colonial period is saturated with instances of that. That one of the things that's wrong and dangerous about human beings is that we can really be persuaded that we are really right, even when it comes to things that are outlandish or criminal, And the corrective is the idea that we owe courtesy to one another, the arbitrary stop and consider that would come with the idea that morality is really a human vocation. That is, we can pretend that there's some nature that allows us to be the apex predator or something like that. But no, that's not how it works. And the world is getting very, very wounded by generations and generations of apex predators. It might look, convincing in an old anthropology or something, but it's not how we can live if having a livable space in the universe is, an ideal we should aspire to. Yes, I have.
Yeah. You seem to embrace the idea of quantum mechanics as allowing for God's sovereignty. Do I have that right?
Yes, you have that right. And it's God actually satisfies even the relatively modest descriptions we've made of him. Our greatest interaction with God is of his restraint. You know, I mean, nobody who believes in God in a serious way doubts his ability to act in any way at any time, at the same time that we are put in a world that is suited to us in the sense that we feel we can know it, we know how to predict its consequences, of so on. And so I see, you know, the physics that I have tried to understand as being something that allows latitude within stability. That, you know, I mean, the things that were being said in the last lecture about Newton, you know, understanding the potential kind of volatility of the universe as, you know, various gravitational effects and so on. There is, you know, the perspective that has been removed that is traditional in Christian thought is that there's God on the other side of things, that we see an effect and we can posit a cause, and the cause we can say is an act of God, you know? Now, we've been schooled away from this by thinking that is supposed to be considered scientific, because you're not supposed to act as if God is a given or God is the origin of anything that happens. But then again, if you think of the utter improbability of the world, you know, and all it contains, there is no basis for excluding the idea of God and a divine creation from the utter improbability, to put it, you know, succinctly, of the existence of the world at all. You know, that why is, you know, I mean, you can say these things and scientists will say, well, there's a scientific answer. No doubt that's true. But nevertheless, we live in a regime in which gravity is a very weak force, you know. Now, everything that's true about us is conditioned on the fact that gravity is a very weak force, you know. There is nothing that removes the possibility of intention from phenomena that happen to be consistent with the life of Adam and his descendants, you know. I mean, it's like excluding the human self, in effect. You know, when you read these old sciences of things like, you know, Darwinism and so on, the self is just a higher ape at best, you know. Then now we're living in a world where unfathomably complex behavior by one species has revolutionized the terms of life. That's not a slightly smarter ape. That's something else entirely, you know. And I think that, you know, we decapitate humankind by excluding attention to the cultures, sciences, all the rest of it, become arts, you know, that come from humankind. We decapitate, in a certain sense, the universe by excluding as impossible the idea that there could be a God that can interact with reality, you know. And the thing about quantum is that it is literally true that you know, whatever is the subject of scrutiny is modifiable by external influences, an observer, a word, a touch, another electron, you know. If you have something that appears reliable and static, that has those reassuring qualities, and at the same time you know that it is subject to modification in any way at any time, then you exclude intention, and then one term that could make it understandable that something that happens is not chance in the way Einstein used the word, but something that Einstein might himself prefer, you know, design of a certain kind, although that's been forbidden to us for a long time. But nobody, that the whatever it is, the thing I can't describe, the thing that is not the universe, but the more absolute being that we can't imagine when we think of universe, you know. When we think of that, if we insist on things that look like, think of the word laws, you know. We were speaking before about Newton and so on, talking about laws, and they're taking this from the Bible, you know. you remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. How arbitrary is that? The whole meaning of the legal system in the Bible, except for things that are clearly sort of public health issues, is to acknowledge a reality above reality by acknowledging the arbitrariness of, what one is obliged to do or not to, So anyway, it seems to me as if you try to understand the world in the quantum terms, insofar as I understand them, you cannot exclude such things as arbitrary dimensions of reality or arbitrary demands on human nature or arbitrary aspects of human nature, because if we are classically, theistic, we think of a will being active in the world that modifies what the world intrinsically, or the local reality of the world would be,
And the stars, the Hubble, what do we call them, masterpieces. I don't feel like I can believe in the God that I, quote unquote, once knew as a child. What do those photos and personal, possibly, experiences of the Milky Way some nights at home, do they inspire part of the reflection that you've been giving us today?
They certainly do. It's funny how certain things happen in your life, and when I was a child, I went to church with my grandfather once, and I heard someone read Psalm 8. I can now consider the heavens, the works of their fingers. So it had the feeling at that moment, which I've never forgotten, that was significant for me. It wasn't just a psalm, it was the psalm, And I love the Hubble telescope. I love the successor telescope, especially when you start thinking in terms of the fact that extension and so on, just like Milton said, is a construct of the mind, not an intrinsic, what we would call a fact or reality, But there is this flaunting of creative possibility. Everywhere we look, more and more, puzzling, why do the galaxies closer to the edge of the universe look mature? They shouldn't, all of that really is well, frankly, I read science to the extent that I do, and, especially things about, the starry universe, because it's better than most theology. Way.
Thank you so much for this memorable phrase, freedom we can't explain and contingencies we cannot account for. Thank you for that. And on this note, I'd like to bring the antidote to the Calvin guy in the room. I'd like to bring Luther into the room because they were also in conflict. And I'd like to sort of open up metaphysics rather than morals, because I think from the Lutheran perspective, one actually introduces an antidote to the sort of moral possibilities of human nature and actually depresses them. For Luther, even the saints in their best intentions can do sin. And if we follow the theologian Marilynne McCord-Adams, we have to now contend with things that are called horrendous evils. And as she describes them, those are the evils that are sort of ricocheted around the world that are much greater than the human imaginations of even being able to conceive. So I'm wondering about your kind of moralist orientation, and I'm wondering, what kind of God, what notion of God besides restraint does that open up? Because I think from this Lutheran intervention, one ends up having a God who is incredibly more redemptive in the salvific sense than from a moralist angle.
I don't want to suggest that Calvin associates redemption with moral perfection or moral accomplishment at all. As a matter of fact, he says, you cannot judge other people. You have no idea what value God assigns to their apparent performance of being in the world, He says, as I said, that I mean, he's a Frenchman, right? Much is courtesy for him, I mean, it's really quite charming. Well, of course, you encounter an image of God whenever you deal with another person. Then what is required of you? And it's a kind of, reverential courtesy, in effect, like you might find between Abraham and God at the beginning of Genesis. The resistance between Calvin and Luther was on Luther's side, not Calvin's side. And Calvin called Luther the great modern apostle. He makes no question at all about his indebtedness to Luther. So I think that the distinctions that are made between them are often perhaps not historically supportable from their own writing. Certainly not from Calvin's side. He certainly didn't suggest that anyone could not sin, for example. He assumed saints were people who were beloved by God and we'd never know who they are.
Thank you so much. I want to propose that we take a 5-minute break and then continue this in our conversation setting. Sure.
Sure.
Okay. Thank you so much.